started lecturing. Okay, lecturing now. Right. Give me a minute. Okay, yes, I'm hitting record. Okay, right. So let's just recap quickly. Do you understand what this code was supposed to do? Could you please put your hand up if you don't understand what this program was supposed to do? So no, don't worry about the code. Just, do you remember, do you understand what the program was meant to do? Okay, so if anyone puts their hand up, it means that, no, you didn't quite understand. Anyone online? Okay, so there was someone who didn't understand what the program was supposed to do. So for the benefit of the online people, the program was supposed to allow a user to specify that they were interested in adding together a bunch of numbers. Does this make sense? And so they would say, oh, I want to add 3 numbers together, and the program will go, very well, I will accept 3 numbers from you, give me those 3 numbers, I will then add it up together when you have given me all 3 numbers. Does this make sense? Does this make sense, online people? Yes, okay. Well, one more person has said yes. All right, okay, that's good. So now you understand that the program should do that. If you look at my program, sorry, let's go up. Notice that there is my user interface, and does this make sense in terms of how we're going to capture the information from the user? Right. So for those of you who are not sure, let me just try and quickly laser pointer and do this. So that first text box is for the user to say, I'm interested in entering so many numbers. All right? And the second text box says, all right, you told me you want so many numbers. What are those numbers? Put it into this one text box here. All right. Now, some of you might in your mind go, wait, I said I want to put in 100 numbers. Surely your program must give 100 text boxes for me to enter all 100 numbers. Now, that's not going to be very good, is it? Sign and physical people. Is that going to be difficult? Absolutely. Why? Because while you're busy dragging and dropping controls onto your form, do you know, before you start running the program, how many text boxes you have to put up there? No, because for all we know, the user was going to have to say, 1. I want you to add 1 number. Then you go, cool, 1 text box. But if the user says 100 numbers, you go, oh, 100. And then there was a comment there who said, okay, I thought I need to generate 100 text boxes. And there was a laughy, you know, the emoji with the tears in the eyes laughing. So clearly he thought it was funny. Do you find it funny? Do you find it challenging? Do you think it can be done? It can be done, but we're not going to do that, okay? Because it's really complicated. So remember, we're just learning to program, start off. This one single text box represents the single place where we can start entering our values, regardless of whether it's 1 number to add, or 1,000 numbers to add, or just 2 numbers to add. Does this make sense? Right. So how this program is meant to work is that there's 1 text box, and then when you've got that 1 text box, you enter a number. You want Visual Basic to go, I acknowledge that you want to capture so many numbers. That's why we have a button. A button, so that's why there's 2 buttons here, because there's 1 button to say, first tell me how many numbers, all right? So we can then, Visual Basic can then go, cool, I'm ready. You told me this is how many numbers to add up. Well, and so I will prepare this program in such a way that I'm ready to accept so many numbers you specify. Does this make sense? Right, because if you don't have that, then this program's like, oh, I don't know how many numbers you want to specify. Right, so the first button is easy. Hopefully you're like, oh, that's straightforward, because all that happens is we're going to capture the number that the user specifies here and store it in a variable. That's all. Does this make sense? The second text box, on the other hand, is where you go, now that VB knows how many numbers that you are going to read in, I must keep track of how many times I allow you to give me a number. Because if you don't do that, what's to stop a user from saying, oh, I need to add up 100 numbers, but I lose track of how many numbers I'm supposed to read in, and so I might end up giving you only 99 numbers. Maybe I'll give you 101. So your program needs to enforce, are you adding up enough numbers? Does this make sense? Right, so that is what the second button has to do, in addition to doing the actual job of adding up the numbers. Does this make sense? And if the program has to check whether or not you entered the correct amount of numbers, what is the one tool? Because you've only been taught one thing so far. So now it's not even a choice. You have a choice of one. What is the one thing? What is the one control structure you know of you should use to check when a user specified the enough number, the correct number of numbers they can start adding and display? Online people, they are looking at, the physical people are looking at me very blankly. Online person, one says an if statement. Do you agree, physical people? It's a very, very restrained, I've got like 4 people who said it's an if statement online. Any more buy-ins? What do you know so far? Are you normally this quiet? No, seriously, what do you know so far? What do you know in terms of control structures? The if statement, don't you? So would it make sense for us to go and ask you a question concerning something you haven't been taught before? Would that be fair? So if you only know if statements and I'm asking you, how are we going to answer this question? What do you think the answer is going to be? If statements. Does this make sense? Think about what an if statement does. What does an if statement do? It provides an appropriate response based on a certain condition. Is this not an example of that? The program needs to decide, do I display the total or do I not display the total? Isn't that an if statement? Online people? Still hearing me? Yes, okay. Right. Sometimes I walk a small little distance away. I haven't actually stepped away. But I think I'll try and stick to you. All right. So, the second button needs to contain if statements, maybe one, maybe more, but you'll know how many there are because you've looked at the code yesterday. What it's meant to do is meant to check for a number of things. Meant to check number 1, have you read in the correct number of numbers yet? If you have, so if I say, if the user says, I want to add 3 numbers together, and this person reads in 4 numbers, should you add the 4th number to your sum? No, okay? So you'll use an if statement to check. Have you read enough numbers? Because if you read, no, don't. No more numbers. But on top of that, if it's no more numbers, what else must the program do? It must display the sum, right? Okay, so let's see how that works. You'll notice that I've actually got a third text box at the bottom, and it's a little bit grayed out compared to the two text boxes at the top. Now, why is that? Well, I like trying to make my user interface as user-friendly as possible. So in other words, what I attempt to do then is I try to say, well, should a user be able to type anything in that third text box? Yes or no? No. Okay, online people, you agree? It's no. Okay. So if I don't want them to type anything in there, what I would normally do is in the properties window, you know what I'm talking about. So you select the text box, you go to the properties window. At this moment, there's only two things you know to do for a text box. You know you need to change the name of the text box, and you check to see if the text of the text box is empty at this moment because it's an empty text box. But if you wanted to put some text in the text of the text box, you would type something in. But I then look for something called read only. What do you think read only is going to do? So it's a true or false setting for that text box. It's not compulsory to do this. I'm just letting you know it's a personal preference of mine. Mr. Levier doesn't do it. I do it. This just gives you an idea that each of you are your own individuals. So when you submit a practical assignment, it might be the same problem, but you are all going to do it differently somewhat. Okay? So I like doing it by setting the text boxes that are for output to read only. And what that does is, as you can imagine, the text box then is only readable, not writable. So you can't type. The user cannot type into that text box. When you set a text box to read only, it automatically changes the shade of that text box to a lighter gray so that users can see it and go, I see that this is not a space for me to type anything. And it makes sense because you don't want the user to go, I don't know how to use this program, so I'm going to type something there, and then type something there, and then what's going on? Okay, so that's just a little bonus, I suppose, to talk about. But again, note, it's not necessary for you to do it. If you're in a semester test or an exam and you're trying to get things done, setting this to read only is the last thing you should be thinking of. You should be focusing on writing the code and making sure everything works. All right, so in terms of the first button, I don't think there were any queries about this code, were there? No, I mean, it's a single line, no issues. It's the second one that is perhaps a little more complicated because there's a lot more to go through. So the first thing you want to do is you want to check if you can add a number. In other words, is the num numbers equal to 0? Because if the num numbers is equal to 0 and you're sitting there thinking, what do you mean num numbers is equal to 0? So what I've done here is I'm using a countdown approach. In other words, you start and you go, remember in the first button you ask, how many numbers do you want to read in? And you say, I want to read in 3 numbers, all right? So on this button, I check to see if that number is at the moment 0. Why? Because I intend, and if you look through the rest of the code, I intend to change that num numbers by -1 each time someone enters a value. Does this make sense? In other words, if you say, let's work through this. Okay, so we're working with the scenario that the user said, I want to add 3 numbers. What is num numbers at this point? 3. Okay, it's 3. So, let's consider the following. Now, I am going to press this button, the second button, I'm going to give them a number. So in other words, I'm going to say 10. 10 is going to be my first number, all right? So I put in 10 and I press this button. And it checks, is num numbers 3 at this point? I mean, is it 0 at this point? No, what is the value of num numbers at this point? Online people, are you getting this? It's 3 at the moment, right? Num numbers is 3. It's 3 at the moment because if you go back to the previous slide, you'll notice that num numbers, I type in 3, I get 3 and I store it in the variable num numbers. I then go to the second text box, put in the value 10, and I press the button. When I press the button, I'm asking, check if you can add numbers. And how am I going to check? I'm going to evaluate whether num numbers is 0 or not. Right. So in other words, I want to check num numbers at the moment is 3. Isn't it? Is it 0? No. So if it's not 0, and here is what it gets confusing, because remember in an if statement, if a number is 0, if it's true, it executes a certain code, and if it's false, it executes something else, right? If it's true that the number is equal to 0, what does that mean? If we got to a point where num numbers is actually 0 right now, what does that mean? Remember we said that what happens is each time we press the button, if we can still add numbers, we would take that number, add it to our sum, and then subtract 1 from num numbers. So at this point, it's still 3, isn't it? So if it's still 3, then that's at me. Can I still add numbers to my sum? Yes, I can. Right. Ladies and gentlemen, I see that people online, there are people that haven't turned off their mics and you're interfering with the sound. Please turn it off. Sorry, I just want to check that the online people are all behaving. I apologize. Let's see if has everyone turned off their mics now? Let me check. Okay, it looks like everyone is behaving. Okay, so for the benefit of the online people, right, let's do the following. So what we're saying is that with this algorithm, we want to check whether or not we can still add a number to our sum, because the whole point of the second button is the user specifies a value in the second text box and says add this number to my sum. And remember this code, this button needs to track, have you entered the correct number of numbers yet? If you haven't, I'll let you, but if you go over, I'm going to stop you. You may not do it anymore. So the first point is I say check if you can add the number. One thing you're really checking is your num numbers equal to 0 at this point? If it is 0, what does it mean? It means, and the physical people said, it means that we have already added all the numbers we needed. So in our example, we said the user specifies that there are 3 numbers that they want to add up together. At this point, when I go to the second button, I go to the second text box, and I put in the value 10, and I press the button, I add this number. What happens is it checks, is this number 0 or not? The reason why it checks if it's 0 or not is if it is 0, if num numbers is 0 at this point, it would mean that it has already added all the numbers. You cannot add any more numbers at this point. All right, so yes. T Majake is saying if num number is equal to 0, then the program will just go to the third step. Does this make sense? Right. If it's not 0, then we must do step 2. Does this make sense? All right. Okay, so thank you, T Majake. You're right there. So what's actually happening in step 2? Because if we can add numbers, we need to add the number. But in addition to adding the number, what else must we do? We must subtract num numbers by 1 to indicate now you can still add 2 more numbers. Does this make sense? If I had 3, and I press this button and it goes, oh, I see you haven't reached your limit yet. I let you add this number, and we're going to update the count to 2, because it means you can still add 2 more numbers. Then the user will add another number, let's say 20, and presses the button again. It will check, is numbers at the moment 2, 0. It's 2, right? It means you still can add. So it takes the 20 and it adds it to the 10 that's in the sum. And it subtracts numbers by 1 again. Does this make sense? When it does that, then it means that how many more numbers can you still add? 1 more. What is numbers at this point? 1. So when I click the button and I say I'm going to put in 30 in the second text box and press the button again, what am I going to get? Will I jump straight to 3, or I'll continue with step 2? I'll continue with step 2. Does this make sense? Okay, so I go into step 2, I take that 30 and I add it to the sum, which is 30 at the moment, because it's 20 plus 10. I get 30 plus 30 equals 60. What will I do with numbers? Subtract it again, and it becomes 0. All right. Now, you also notice that there's a little 5 here. There's a step 5. Here, there's a step 5 there. It's 5.1 and 6.1 there. A bit confusing here. But if all your numbers have been added up, then you want to put the sum in the third text box, because you're done. Once you've added everything up, then you display the sum in the third text box. All right. Now, there is actually a question that says, then what if we are initialized to numbers equal to 1? Does that make sense? Do we initialize numbers to 1 at any point? No. Where do we do the initialization? In other words, where do we set numbers to the correct starting value, so to speak? In the first button. Does this make sense? Because in the first button, you are telling the program, listen here, there are going to be so many numbers we want to add up. Does this make sense? All right. Okay. Now, Innocent Log or online actually said the program should stop when there's 1 number left. Is that correct? Should it stop when there's 1 number left? When should it stop? When there's no numbers left. Does this make sense? So, the one thing I actually want to ask is this. You all know that order in your code is pretty important most of the time. There's one incident where order isn't important, and that is at this point in time in your life, and that is your option strict and your option explicit. You can swap those around. Ooh, adventurous. Right? Everything else, order becomes extremely important. For example, can you work out an average before you work out the total? You could, but the answer is going to be wrong, right? So the same thing happens here with code. So I want to ask you all, online people and physical people, what happens if I move this line, numbers, and I subtract numbers by 1, top. Will that be a problem? Okay, so let's go to the next slide where the actual code is. Do that, next slide. Okay, before I do that, I just want to talk about this. So your test data, can you see this is an example of test data, 2 sets. You agree that this is okay as test data, or is this terribly wrong? Are you all wondering? So let's take a look at that. You've got first test set inputs. You input 3 numbers. There's the numbers I want to add in. And then you'll see that I've got the sum is equal to 25. So in other words, how will I use the first data set, test data set, in my testing? That is like 32 minutes later. If we were waiting for him to turn on the data projector, we would have a problem. Unless he wasn't the data projector person. So how would I use this test data set? Online people, how would you use this test set? The first one. Obviously, there's two sets. Yeah, yes, okay. T Majakis continuing on a row. It says you would add 3 in the first text box, and then you would press the first button, and then you shouldn't continue there. Let the other people continue. What happens next? Then you would put in 5 in the second text box, and you would push the second button. Then you would push in 10, second button, and then 10 again, second button, and then what should you expect? You should expect 25 in the third text box. If it doesn't do that, it means that your program is a problem. Okay, and you do the same thing with test set 2. Is it important for you to have more than one test set? Yes, it is. Why? Because you're testing for different scenarios. Okay. All right, anyway, this, not a trick, no. Moving on, let's look at this code, which seems to be the source of confusion for many people. Now, we did say that there was an error with the code, and then people went, I don't know if the lecturers pointed it out, but here is the error. So you've got, if numbers is not the same as 0, and the reason why we put in if numbers is not the same as 0 as opposed to the number is equal to 0 is because, remember, an if statement works as how? You have an if condition, and if it is true, it will do the following. The else part is if it's false, then it will do something else. Does this make sense? So if we had said if numbers is equal to 0, that means you can't add any more numbers. And if you did the code this way, it would be, you can't add any more numbers. Give me more numbers. Is that what you want? Okay, so that's another way of doing it. All right? But the way I've done it is I said it can't be 0 because eventually, because we're subtracting by 1 each time, it would have to go through 0. Does that make sense? Okay, so your option is another possibility. And that's why it's all about programming style again. Neither of ours is more correct than the other. So for the online people, the question is, could you just check if the numbers is greater than 0? If it's greater, then it means that there's still a positive value and you can keep adding. All right. So, like I say, it's really important that you understand the other possibilities to this code. This is the answer, which is also the reason why we don't supply memos to you of this is the code for last week's prep, because then you all get tunnel vision and you say, this is the answer. What are we trying to teach you? We're trying to teach you problem solving. Problem solving is not going on the internet. The internet says this is the answer, and I'm going to take that answer and I'm going to put it in my own code. It's not the way to go. You need to come up with your own solutions, and there will be variations of that answer. Okay, so if you take a look at this, what this does is I go, okay, I'm going to check to see if it's not 0. Because if it's not 0, it means, and we're not going to go -1, nobody's going to put in, I plan to put in -2, we hope. Again, assuming that our users won't do something that silly. If they go, I plan to put in 2 numbers, if it's not 0, then it's going to capture the number from the second text box. Take that number and add it to the sum, because it's obviously something that needs to be added. Then I update my numbers by 1, as in subtract it by 1 to say, I've added this number, there's 1 more number in my example, because I said there were 2 numbers I want to add up. There's only 1 more number you want to add, And then the other thing I also do is I have a second if statement here where I check if num numbers is 0 now. If num numbers is 0 now, it means that we just added this last number and this happens to be the last one. We don't have any more numbers to add, so I want to display the total in my text box. But otherwise, if it's the case that it's actually we've reached 0 and the person wants to add, let me add, then you don't want to give them the opportunity to add, right? Do you? You don't. So you want to be nice and then put in a prompt that says, no more adding. By the way, the sum is this already. Does this make sense? Okay, so that is the code. Now, for consideration tomorrow and beyond, which is now actually today, and we are past that. Questions to ponder here. So how do we reset the program so we can add again? Okay, so that's the one question I want to ask. How many of you have implemented this code or attempted to? Okay, 1, 2, anyone online who's implemented it? All right. Some have already spitting answers back at me, all right? Okay, so that's the one thing I wanted you to consider. Are there other ways to check if we can add numbers? This gentleman here in front basically gave that option, okay? Is there a more elegant way to check? That also ties into this question. Can I keep track of how many numbers I've added so far? Okay, in other words, you know, if you've got a really long list of numbers, like number 1 is this, number 2 is this, number 3 is this, number 4 is this. I thought I uploaded the slides I believe already. Are they not? Okay, thank you for pointing it out. I will upload these slides. Keep track of how many numbers I've added so far. So in other words, would it be nice if the program said, please enter the number for number 1. Please enter the number for number 2. Online people, what do you think? Would it be nicer to be prompted, you need to enter the number for number 1 now, number for number 2? Okay, and then that last question here, if I had 100 numbers to add up, would I really have to click on the button 100 times in this program of mine? See, you're all like going, no, that's wishful thinking. Based on how I've done this program right now, do I need to? Yes, you would have to, because you have to click the button to say, I've just entered 10, enter. I've just entered 20, enter. I've just entered 30, enter. Who is in favor of clicking the button 100 times? Let it be known, online people, that the physical people are not putting their hand up. Anyone here? No one. It's just Kellen saying no one. They're answering on behalf of everybody else. Okay, so that was the issue. Now it's already 10:20, and that means we have no hope. By the time I load the second lecture, we are going to be time's up. But let's quickly give you a recap of or a teaser of what to expect for. Okay, let's do that quick. Right, okay, so this was more answering this question, how to reset. Well, if you click on the first button, it allows you to set the number of numbers to add to the sum. So think about it this way, you start and you say, I have 3 numbers I want to add up, and then what happens? It allows you 3. If I go back to the first button and I say, I want to now add 5 numbers, and you go, find that you're able to start adding 5 numbers to your sum. The problem, however, is if you have a sum of 60 already from the previous set of addition, it means that you have this problem where whatever you add now gets added to the 60. So it keeps the total from your previous session, and the one thing we want to do is we want to initialize sum to 0 at the same time when we set how many numbers we want to add. Does this make sense? Because we're starting a new fresh set of numbers to add. Go, I want to add 5 numbers now. Set sum to 0, so we start afresh. That's easy, simple. All right. Another approach is we could use a additional variable called counter. And what counter does is it keeps track of how many numbers you've added so far. Okay, does this make sense? So you start the counter at 0 to indicate, I'm interested in adding 3 numbers. Sum will be initialized to 0. Count is initialized to 0 because at this point, how many numbers have you added? 0. Okay, and then if you look at the code here, you'll see if counter is less than numbers, it means you haven't added the sufficient number of numbers because counter keeps track. And there you'll see that counter is being used to track how often you have already added numbers, and that's something to consider. All right, so please just take a look at this for now, and you'll see the approach is different. We're not subtracting from numbers anymore. Number stays the same. We're now using an additional variable called counters to keep track of how many times we've added so far. And then once we know that the number of the counter matches the number of numbers, we've hit the limits, and then we say no, stop, no more adding of numbers. All right, I'm going to stop here, ladies and gentlemen. I know we had some queries. Please ask me those questions now. Afterwards, there is a question of how about adding a new button to reset? Yes, you can do that. Again, it is about programming style, it's about writing the code. Okay, queries you can ask me afterwards. I'm going to press the stop button. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this afternoon session. This morning session. I'm going to remember to stop the record button this time. Enjoy your day unless you are in the practical tutorials. I'll see you then.